Do you think you would have survived the Old West? Maybe when it comes to guns, horses, or the heat, but hygiene, probably not. In this video, you're going to find out what hygiene was like in the American Old West of the 1870s. The lack of bathing that lasted for weeks, the diseases of the Old West that killed far more people than bullets ever did, and the hygiene customs of the Old West that would turn any modern person into a hospital patient within days. The story of the Old West that movies tell is way too clean. The living conditions in the Old West were a daily exercise in survival against nameless, faceless, bulletless enemies, just microbes, parasites, and contaminated water. And it all started the moment you opened your eyes in the morning. In 1871, Teddy Blue Abbott arrived in Kansas after 3 months driving cattle along the Chisholm Trail. He described in his memoirs, published decades later in the book We Pointed Them North, what he felt when he finally entered a town with minimal structure. The smell of his own body was so intense that the horses around the barbershop seemed bothered by it. Abbott wasn't exaggerating to impress his readers. He was reporting the norm, the daily life of men who lived a life that movies would never dare to show with complete honesty. Bathing in the Old West was a rare event. And not for lack of personal care, it was because the circumstances made bathing an inaccessible luxury for the overwhelming majority of people who lived and worked in the territories of the American West during the 1870s. A cowboy on a cattle drive could go 40 to 60 days straight without any contact with hot water, soap, or a towel. The most you could manage was a quick wipe of the face and hands, using the same dust-soaked bandana that spent the entire journey hanging around your neck, soaking up sweat, grease, and soot from the nightly campfires. In Hollywood movies, cowboys arrive in towns with relatively clean clothes, neat hair, and tanned but presentable faces. The reality of life in the Old West when it came to hygiene was different in almost every visible way. Accounts from the era preserved in the archives of the Tombstone Epitaph and the Dodge City Times describe men arriving at saloons with layers of accumulated dust on their skin, clothes soaked through with sweat, cattle grease, and coal from campfires, and a smell that local merchants learned to ignore as a basic condition of financial survival. Business owners in frontier towns knew that turning away smelly customers meant shutting their doors, because there wouldn't be enough clientele to keep them open. When a bath finally happened, it was a completely different ritual from anything we know today. In towns with slightly better infrastructure, like Abilene, Dodge City, or Fort Worth, there were establishments known as bathhouses, places with zinc tubs that were shared among multiple customers throughout the day, with the same water being reused until it turned visibly dark and murky. The price of a bath under those conditions ranged between 25 cents and $1, a significant amount for a cowboy earning between $20 and $30 a month for hard work. Doing the math is simple and brutal. A single bath could cost between 2 and 5% of a man's monthly wage. Today, you consider a hot shower so trivial that you barely count it as an expense. In 1870, it was a cost that required deliberation. In more remote camps and ranches, the process was even more improvised. A metal basin, water heated over a fire, and the whole body washed with homemade lye soap, an abrasive product made from ashes and animal fat that cleaned the skin but also irritated it considerably. Many preferred to avoid soap when possible, especially in winter, when cold water made the experience uncomfortable to the point of unbearable. Charles Goodnight, one of the great names in Old West history and the creator of the Goodnight-loving trail, mentioned in preserved accounts that his men quickly learned to make pragmatic choices. When water was scarce, it was saved for drinking, not washing. The lack of hygiene in the Old West, however, was not a sign of cultural neglect or a less developed civilization. It was a direct reflection of life on the American frontier: absence of infrastructure, scarcity of clean water in arid regions, and a routine of extreme physical work that left little room for anything beyond the immediate necessities of survival. Today, you spend maybe 15 minutes taking a shower, drying your hair, putting on deodorant, and you get on with your day. In 1870, in the Arizona Territory or the interior of Kansas, that same set of actions could represent hours of work just to heat enough water, find available soap, and have a moment of privacy. Hygiene in the 19th century American West wasn't negligence. It was impossible logistics. In classic westerns, when a character gets thirsty in the middle of the plains, he finds a crystal-clear stream, bends over it, and drinks directly, with the camera capturing the reflection of the blue sky on the surface. The scene is beautiful, cinematic, and, in a good number of real cases on the American frontier of the 1870s, potentially lethal. Because health in the old West had an enemy that no rifle could fight. Contaminated water, invisible and everywhere in practically every territory of the American West. Sanitation in the Old West was practically non-existent as an organized concept. Towns that grew in a chaotic and rapid fashion during gold rushes, railroad expansion, and the mass arrival of settlers had no sewer systems, no waste separation, and no water treatment. Human and animal waste ended up in the same streams and springs from which people drew water for drinking, cooking, and washing. The proximity between stables, pigsties, cemeteries, and drinking water wells was nearly universal in frontier towns of the 1870s. In Tombstone, in the Arizona Territory, whose municipal records are partially preserved, researchers found evidence of water wells dug less than 30 feet from waste pits. A combination that, to any modern microbiologist, is the stuff of nightmares. The result was predictable, even for those who didn't understand the actual mechanisms of disease transmission. The diseases of the Old West killed at a rate that action movies simply ignore entirely. According to historical research, based on medical and civil records of the era, compiled by historians such as Robert Utley and D. Brown, it's estimated that for every man killed in an armed confrontation on the plains and territories of the West, somewhere between 10 and 20 died from diseases directly related to the poor sanitary conditions in which they lived. Cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery, pneumonia. These were the real killers of the American frontier, not the wide-brimmed hat gunslingers that Hollywood immortalized. The cholera epidemic of 1867 devastated entire communities along stagecoach routes and cattle drive trails. Historical records from the era indicate that towns like Abilene and Junction City in Kansas lost significant portions of their population within weeks during the most intense outbreaks. Historian T.J. Stiles, in his research on Jesse James and the socio-economic context of the American frontier, describes how the James family, like so many others in Missouri and Kansas, lost members to diseases that today would be treated with common antibiotics within a few days of medication. Cholera, which in 1867 killed healthy adults within hours of the onset of symptoms, would today have a treatment protocol resolvable at any basic health clinic. An experienced cowboy knew how to distinguish relatively safe water from contaminated water by a few empirical signs. The color, the smell, the presence of dead animals nearby, the appearance of the riverbed, and the reaction of his horses, which often refused to drink water that was visibly unfit. This knowledge was passed down orally through generations of cowboys, and long before them, by the native peoples who had inhabited those lands for millennia. The Lakota and Apache nations had sophisticated knowledge about safe water sources in their territories, knowledge that settlers frequently ignored out of cultural prejudice, paying the price with their own health and, with brutal frequency, with their own lives. Today, you turn on a faucet and receive treated, filtered water with potability standards monitored by government systems that exist specifically so you never have to think about what you're drinking. In 1870, on the frontier of the New Mexico Territory, A thirsty man had to decide between drinking water of questionable appearance or continuing to walk under a sun that, according to estimates based on historical climate records, could easily exceed 104 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer. That decision, seemingly simple, drink or don't drink, could be the last one he ever made. To understand how people cleaned themselves in the Old West, or tried to, you have to start with teeth, because they tell a specific and brutally honest story about the living conditions of the era. Oral health in the American territory of the 1870s was a chapter unto itself in the long volume of everyday suffering on the frontier, and it rarely shows up in the curiosities about Old West hygiene that circulate in popular books and documentaries. Dentistry as an organized science was in a primitive stage during the 1870s. What existed in frontier towns was, at best, a barber with some rudimentary knowledge of tooth extractions, performed without adequate anesthesia, with metal instruments that frequently transmitted infections from patient to patient due to the complete absence of any sterilization process. Pulling a tooth could take less than a minute of physical procedure and days of post-operative agony, with infections that spread to the jaw, and in serious cases to adjacent regions of the skull. At worst, the person in question tried to handle the problem themselves with a pair of pliers, a cup of whiskey for partial anesthesia, and a whole lot of determination born out of desperation. Wyatt Earp, one of the most documented figures in all of Old West history, mentioned in numerous accounts the overwhelming prevalence of toothaches among the residents of Dodge City and Tombstone, towns he knew both as a lawman and as a citizen. Doc Holliday, whose nickname Doc came from an actual dental degree obtained from the Philadelphia College of Dental Surgery, one of the best dental schools in the United States at the time, was technically one of the most qualified dentists in the Arizona Territory. But even Holliday, whose biographical records have been extensively researched by historians like Gary Roberts, had a limited clientele because most people preferred to avoid any intervention until the pain became completely unbearable. The fear of the dentist in 1870 wasn't irrational. It was based on real experiences of procedures performed without effective anesthesia in dirty environments by practitioners with irregular training. The frontier diet made the problem worse in a systematic and relentless way. The basic diet of a cowboy consisted largely of beans, dried meat, sourdough biscuits, the famous sourdough, and extremely strong and bitter coffee. Sugar was scarce and expensive, which paradoxically protected part of the population from cavities, but the hardness of the food, the absence of any dental cleaning routine, and the general poor nutrition created conditions favorable to abscesses, infections, and early tooth loss. Archaeological records from cemeteries in towns like Deadwood in the Dakota Territory reveal that most adults of the era had already lost several teeth before reaching 40. For many, the loss began well before 30. Toothbrushes did exist in rudimentary versions made of bone or wood with bristles of pig hair or horsehair. They were a commercially produced item since the mid-19th century, but uncommon in camps and ranches due to cost and logistical availability. More common was the use of branches from certain types of wood, chewed and frayed at the ends, to create a kind of natural scrubber, a technique that cowboys learned in part from indigenous peoples who used branches from plants with mildly antimicrobial properties, and coarse salt rubbed directly with a finger, which had some abrasive effect but little impact on bacteria. Toothpaste as a commercial product existed in primitive versions, some even advertised in Harper's Weekly in the 1870s, but it was expensive, hard to obtain in remote territories, and considered superfluous by men who had more pressing concerns. The result, in the words of historian Walter Prescott Webb in his studies of life on the American Great Plains, was a population with dental health that, by the standards of any modern dental office, we would classify as a collective emergency with no solution in sight. What hygiene in the Old West was like necessarily passed through that dental reality, painful, permanent, and completely ignored by cinema. Imagine walking into Dodge City in July of 1872. The sun is already high when you cross the main dirt road, and the smell hits you before anything your eyes can register. It's a mixture that assaults you in an almost physical way. Horse manure mixed with hot dust, the sour smell of meat in the process of decomposing coming from the butcher shops lined up along the main street, the metallic smell of blood from the cattle pens on the edges of town, and behind all of it, a permanent backdrop of accumulated urine, organic trash fermenting in the sun, and smoke from green wood burning in makeshift stoves. The flies are so thick they seem like part of the landscape, forming dense, constant clouds around any leftover food, any animal waste, any dark puddle of liquid in the ditches beside the houses. You swallow hard and try to breathe through your mouth. Within a few hours, you'll give up on that strategy too. That was the reality of sanitation in the Old West, not the romanticized version from the engravings published in Harper's Weekly for readers back east who had never set foot in a territory, but the everyday reality documented in the diaries of traveling physicians, in the public health reports that some territories attempted to implement with scarce resources and minimal political will, and in the personal letters of residents who described the urban conditions of the era with a mix of resignation and horror. Frontier towns grew in a completely disorganized fashion, with no urban planning that considered public health as a relevant variable. There was no organized garbage collection. Household waste was thrown directly into the streets or into ditches beside houses. Toilets were primitive cesspits built just a few feet from water wells, in soils that filtered contaminants in an irregular and insufficient manner. In Tombstone, municipal records from the Arizona Territory show that the town reached a population of more than 5,000 people at a time when sanitation infrastructure was essentially non-existent, not inadequate, not substandard, non-existent in the literal sense of the word. The history of the Old West and public hygiene is, in large part, the history of a systematic absence of any public health infrastructure. There was no urban drainage, no waste treatment, no functional separation between drinking water and sewage runoff. The rivers and streams that ran through towns received everything, and people drank from the same source miles downstream, without knowing and without any way of knowing. Military surgeons at U.S. Army outposts, whose reports are preserved in the National Archives in Washington, repeatedly documented outbreaks of gastrointestinal disease in garrisons that shared water sources with animal corrals, a pattern that repeated itself at Fort Laramie, Fort Union, Fort Dodge, and dozens of other frontier posts. The situation on cattle drive trails was even more precarious than in the towns. On a drive along the Chisholm Trail, the route that went from Texas to Kansas, traveled by tens of thousands of head of cattle throughout the 1860s and 1870s, a group of cowboys spent weeks without any sanitation structure beyond an open space at a respectful distance from camp. Physiological needs were taken care of wherever discretion and distance allowed, and the notion of hand hygiene as a preventive practice simply didn't exist as a conscious concept. The science of the relationship between microorganisms and disease was still being established by Pasteur and Koch in Europe, and would take decades to translate into everyday practices on the American frontier. The curiosities about the Old West and hygiene reveal something that goes beyond simple shock. These were people doing the best they could within a system that had no tools to fight what it couldn't see. Today, we tend to compare that scenario with our modern cities and conclude that people in the 19th century were negligent or careless. But the central problem wasn't a lack of care. It was a lack of knowledge about the actual mechanisms of disease. And that ignorance, in an environment as hostile as the American frontier of the 1870s, came with a price that was high and completely silent. Nat Love was an extraordinary man in almost every conceivable way. A freed former slave after the Civil War, he became one of the most respected and well-documented cowboys of the American West, riding historic trails throughout the territory between Texas and the Dakotas throughout the 1870s and 1880s. Known by the nickname Deadwood Dick after winning a rodeo in Deadwood in 1876, Love was also one of the few cowboys of the era to leave a detailed written record of his experience. In his autobiography, published in 1907, he described with rare honesty the conditions of life in the Old West with regard to personal hygiene. And one of the most recurring themes is the constant battle against parasites that made daily life even more exhausting than the physical work already made it. Lice were near universal companions of the men who worked on the prairies and in the territories of the American West. In the colorful language of the cowboys of the era, they were called graybacks, and their presence was dealt with through a combination of practical resignation and some attempt at control. The available remedies were limited and variably unpleasant. Clothes boiled in water when there were enough resources for the process, the application of kerosene to the scalp, a painful practice that eliminated the parasites but also irritated the skin considerably, or simply manual combing and periodic picking, a technique as old as humanity itself and equally effective within its limitations. Ticks presented an even more serious problem than lice, both in scale and in consequences for health, in the Old West. In regions like Central Texas, the Oklahoma Territory, and the prairies of Kansas, tick density during the warmer months was enough to cover a rider's legs up to the knees within just a few hours of riding through low, dense brush. And ticks, unlike lice, could transmit serious diseases, including Rocky Mountain spotted fever, whose connection to the arachnid wasn't even understood at the time. Men died from this condition without the available physicians having any idea what was causing the progressive fever, the skin rash, and the organ failure that characterized it. Clothing itself was part of the problem and simultaneously one of the few available means of protection. A typical frontier man of the 1870s could work in the same cotton or wool shirt for weeks at a time without washing. The process of doing laundry was laborious at a level that's hard to imagine today. It required enough water, scarce in arid regions, available soap, a fire to heat the water, and dedicated time within a routine that rarely allowed for planned breaks. When washing finally happened under trail conditions, it was generally in an available stream, scrubbing the pieces against rocks with homemade lye soap and leaving them to dry in the sun tied to horse saddles or to the wheels of supply wagons. The result was a partial cleaning that removed some of the visible dirt but did little against the parasites that had colonized the seams of the garments. The skin suffered from multiple simultaneous problems that went beyond parasites. Constant exposure to the relentless prairie sun caused frequent burns, premature skin aging, and sores on the mouth and lips that we now recognize as actinic cheilitis. The abrasive dust of Texas and Arizona created chronic skin irritations that made any minor injury, a scratch, a razor cut, a saddle blister, a serious infection risk. And the absence of any effective protective products made the skin of frontiermen a physical and permanent record of every year spent on the prairies. Hardened, darkened, scarred, and aged well beyond their actual years. Hygiene in the 19th century American West was, in short, a constant negotiation between what was necessary to maintain some basic dignity and health and what was physically possible within extremely limited circumstances. It wasn't carelessness. It was the reality of a life built completely outside any modern comfort infrastructure. In any Hollywood Western produced between the 1950s and 1980s, when a character gets shot, the scene resolves itself with cinematic efficiency. The town doctor extracts the bullet with clean instruments, stitches the wound with visible competence, and the hero is back in action within a few days, slightly limping but essentially whole. It's one of the most well-constructed lies in American popular culture about the Old West. and one of the most damaging in terms of historical understanding, because it hides the most disturbing truth of the entire era. The medical treatment available was frequently more dangerous than the wound itself. The reality of medicine in the Old West was that a gunshot wound, as much as it defines the imagination of the era, was often less dangerous than what came after. The physicians available in the territories of the American West in the 1870s had wildly varying levels of training, from military surgeons with real experience in the American Civil War who at least knew basic field procedures, to outright charlatans who had purchased diplomas by mail or simply called themselves doctors in the absence of any verification system. And even the most competent of them operated in an environment where germ theory, the scientific understanding that bacteria and other microorganisms cause infections, was not yet widespread practical knowledge, much less applied. Surgical instruments were reused without any form of sterilization. The practice of wiping a scalpel with a damp cloth and moving on to the next patient was considered adequate and hygienic by the standards of the time. Washing hands before surgery was an idea that had not yet penetrated American medical practice. The discoveries of Hungarian physician Ignaz Semmelweis regarding the transmission of infections through the hands of doctors were published in 1847, but took decades to translate into real clinical practice, especially in peripheral regions like the American frontier. Post-operative infection killed more patients than the original wounds that motivated the surgeries, a fact documented with painful clarity in the reports of military surgeons of the United States Army at outposts like Fort Laramie, Fort Dodge, and Fort Bliss. For everyday ailments, fever, pain, minor infections, gastrointestinal illnesses, the population turned to a combination of orally transmitted home remedies, preparations based on medicinal herbs of varied origin, and the famous elixirs sold by traveling peddlers who roamed the territories with their colorful wagons and persuasive speeches. These products, which circulated throughout the American West under names like Dr. Pierce's Golden Medical Discovery, Hostetta's celebrated stomach bitters, and dozens of similar variations generally contained a mixture of alcohol in high proportions, narcotics such as opium or morphine chloride in undisclosed dosages, and various substances with little to no real therapeutic effect beyond the temporary relief provided by the alcohol and opiates. They didn't cure anything, but they made the sick person feel slightly better while the disease ran its natural course. Alcohol itself was treated as a universal medicine, completely unquestioned. Whiskey was prescribed with complete seriousness for toothaches, colds, fevers, anxiety, insomnia, digestive problems, and virtually any condition that didn't have a better solution available, which, in the territories of the West in the 1870s, included nearly every imaginable medical condition. Records from military health posts at Fort Laramie and Fort Union show that alcohol appeared regularly and without embarrassment on official lists of medical supplies, not just as an external disinfectant, but as a medication administered internally by medical recommendation. Compare that to today, when you get a simple bacterial infection, a doctor prescribes an antibiotic that will be making a measurable difference within just a few hours. In 1870, that same infection, an infected cut that came into contact with contaminated soil, pneumonia caught on a cold, rainy night, a urinary tract infection ignored for too long, could become fatal within days, with no one around the sick person having any real tools to intervene. Penicillin wouldn't be discovered by Alexander Fleming until 1928, more than 50 years after the period we're discussing. The history of the Old West and its medical hygiene is, in large part, the story of people who got sick and waiting for their own bodies to resolve what the available medicine had no way of curing. Now you understand why we said right at the beginning that you probably wouldn't be able to survive the hygiene of the Old West of the 1870s. And it's not because you're weak or unprepared for physical challenges. It's because your body was shaped in environments that made that reality completely impossible to accept. The filtered water you drink without thinking, the antibiotics that clear up infections in days, the antibacterial soaps, the basic sanitation you take for absolute granted, all of that represents generations of hard-won knowledge, written with the real suffering of people who lived exactly the conditions we've explored here. The hygiene customs of the Old West were not the result of simple ignorance or a morally inferior civilization. They were an honest reflection of a world that still didn't have the tools to fight enemies it couldn't see. And that, in a way, makes those people even more impressive, not despite the extreme conditions they lived in, but because of them. Surviving was, in and of itself, an act of daily resistance. Here's the question I want you to answer in the comments. Which of these Old West hygiene conditions do you think would be the hardest to endure? Weeks without bathing and without clean water, the constant presence of parasites on your body and clothing, or the certainty that any infection could kill you without effective treatment? Pick one and tell me why. It's going to be really interesting to see the responses. If this video changed the way you see life on the American frontier, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. In the next video, we're going to dive into another little-known side of the Old West. And we promise it's going to knock down a few more things you thought you knew about that era. Don't miss it.